Hi. Today I want to talk to you about a Platonic dialogue called the Charmides. It's about a very important virtue from a Greek point of view. The Greek term is sophrosune, and it is hard to translate this into English. It's often translated as temperance, or moderation, or self-control, and it has a number of different aspects. It's something that one gets a feel for when you read these texts, but it's difficult to really put into a single word in English what the virtue of sophrosune means. Before getting into the philosophical substance of the dialogue, I want to say a little bit about background. Charmides and Kritius, two of the key players in this dialogue, are important historical figures in Athens. They are also relatives of Plato. In fact, Charmides was his uncle, Kritius was a cousin. And so Plato has an intimate connection to the events of this time, not only by way of Socrates and generally being a citizen of Athens, but also by being part of the family of two people who by now were notorious. Why? They were associated with the 30 tyrants who ruled Athens after the end of the Peloponnesian War. The 30 tyrants seized power and ended democratic rule in Athens and ruled tyrannically. Kritius in particular was one of those 30 tyrants and was considered a leader, in fact has been described by historians as the first Robespierre, somebody who went on a reign of terror and killed 5% of the Athenian population. The tyrants seized property from citizens, put to death prominent citizens solely because they wanted to seize their property. People were killed, as many as 1,500 people were killed without trial. And so after about 8 months of this, the Athenians rebelled with the help of some exiled pro-democratic forces, overthrew the tyrants in the battle. Both Charmides and Kritius were killed. According to some accounts, Charmides was also one of the 30 tyrants. According to others, he was sent to the city of Piraeus to rule as a tyrant there. In any case, that was just as bad, and the result of all of that was that the key players in this dialogue, the people who are discussing things with Socrates, are tyrants notorious for their lack of temperance, their lack of self-control, their lack of moderation. And so we should keep that in mind. It's as if somebody is writing a dialogue about virtue, and in fact, several of the key characters are people like Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, other notorious tyrants. And so we have to realize that that's a background that not only makes us take the arguments of this dialogue in a different way, but also suggests, look, what matters here is something of huge social and political importance. That is to say, it's not just an abstract philosophical question. What is this virtue and are these people virtuous? It's a critical question, and a question on which many people's lives might depend. There's something else we need to know about this dialogue, and that has to do with the setting. Here Socrates is coming back from the first major battle of the Peloponnesian War, and he's meeting people in Athens who then ask him how the battle went. Socrates doesn't seem to want to talk about it. He just says, well, what I'm really here about is not the war, not to talk about the battle, but instead to talk about the education of youth, the character formation of the people of Athens. That's what really matters. Now, it's striking because that itself is an act of great self-control, of great temperance. Socrates, in fact, behaved heroically in that battle. He saved the life of Alcibiades. He had a lot to brag about. But does he talk about any of that? No. Instead, he restrains himself. And that kind of restraint is key to what sophrosune, temperance, moderation, self-control, is really all about. It's behaving in an orderly, restrained way, among other things. But of course, that's far from a definition. So how does this begin? Well, there's a certain amount of setup here, but then Charmides comes in, and Charmides is considered outstanding, an outstanding pupil, but a little bit lazy, nevertheless excelling supposedly in temperance. And Socrates begins to question him. Throughout this dialogue, there is a kind of background of eroticism and self-control and lack of self-control that is somewhat disturbing, and at the end there is talk of violence and yielding and resistance, or a promise not to resist, etc. All of that too has political echoes, because indeed there was a great deal of violence, a great deal of threatening resistance or failure to resist, Socrates himself gets into trouble, partly because he was associated with some of the tyrants, and partly because he did not, in fact, resist. He stayed in Athens and managed to stay out of trouble, which made him suspect from the point of view of the democratic forces that then took control. In any case, this dialogue is part of what some scholars consider the second group of dialogues, the pre-Middle dialogues. They come after the earliest dialogues of Plato, but they still form a relatively early group. The historical Socrates still is a major player in them and seems to be saying things that the historical Socrates really did say, as far as we can tell. So this group includes the Protagoras, the Meno, the Laches, the Lysis, as well as the Charmides. Now, what is going on in all of these dialogues is similar to the earliest dialogues. We have a request for a definition, generally a definition of a virtue. Someone wants to find out how to develop this virtue, or whether someone else has it. And that leads to the question, well, what is this virtue anyway? And we go off on a quest to try to define that particular virtue. In this case, it's the virtue of sophrosune, or temperance. Now, something very important occurs near the beginning of almost all of these pre-Middle dialogues, and that is there's a critical assumption about the nature of understanding. What is it to know something? Can we know whether Charmides, or Socrates himself, is temperate? Can we know whether they have this virtue of sophrosune? Well, the assumption seems to be that if they do, and if we understand what the word even means, then we should be able to tell. We should be able to articulate what this is. We can't know whether somebody is temperate or not without knowing what temperance is. We can't know whether somebody is virtuous or not without knowing what virtue is. And that's something we ought to be able to tell. As he puts it, in fact, in the Laches, surely what we know we ought to be able to tell. Well, if we think that connection between being able to tell, that is, give a definition, give an account of something, is what it is to understand a thing, then there's an important thesis here, that knowledge requires understanding. To know something requires that we be able to define the terms we're using. There are a variety of problems with this. It seems to diverge from our common sense usage of knowledge. I can't define what a chair is, but I might know whether or not I'm sitting in a chair. And so there's that problem, but in addition to that, if we really require definitions, where do we stop? It looks like that's a demand that is endless in a sense. We give a definition, well, what do those terms mean? What do those terms mean? And so on. So there are issues that eventually emerge in Plato that should lead us to worry about that background assumption, but it occurs throughout the early dialogues.